going to follow on very much from what Kanwar was talking about, because a lot of the talk here does overlap to a certain extent about the location-based services and how privacy is affected by them, but try and put some numbers to those and try and describe the industry that has evolved as a result of the innovations that have taken place and led very much, as Kanwar said, by the iPhone and not by Nokia, sadly. I wanted to put this up. It's a very wordy slide, so I apologise immediately for that. But it was an invited talk by Sir Tim Berners-Lee at Nokia World Conference in 2010. And he identified 4 concerns about the future of the internet, and one of them was privacy. So it's a big topic. If you look at the newspapers, you'll find an article about privacy probably anywhere in the world on every day. So I travel around the world, I'm obsessed about privacy, and I always find an article without fail. And he condensed it into a very nice paragraph, which is that the problem is how to allow the user to share their location while still making it easy for them to understand when they're sharing critical information, how much control they have over that information, and who can access it. And the problem is, as he points out, is how to do that without interfering with the user experience. And that is the bottom line for a mobile phone company. Apps are driving the user experience, and we have very little control over those apps. And we certainly have very little control over the interface between the user and those apps. So how do we do that? So it relates to apps. It more and more and increasingly relates to the freemium business model. And it does concern these small screen sizes and our limited data contracts, which says, are we really going to download a 27-page contract and read it there and then on the spot before accepting the terms? Or do we just go accept? I'm going to contradict slightly something that Kanwar said, that everybody has differences of opinion about privacy. Lots of the research would indicate that actually, whether you're young or old, can you hear me properly at the back? Whether you're young or old, can we turn them? Yeah. No, okay. Whether you're young or old, you still feel the same way about privacy. What we found, and this research was repeated in 2009 and 2010, and there's lots of other papers that do the same thing. What we found is that about 80% of people care strongly about privacy, whether they're young or they're old, wherever they come from. There are different perceptions and different reasons about why they care for privacy, but they all care about it. But they tend to do very little about it. Very few people actually act on their attitudes and on their behaviours. And as we've seen from the freemium business models, everybody seems to be prepared to trade their privacy in return for services. We went on to ask them how they would like to do something about that, and they said if there was a service that they could trust that would manage their privacy for them, 70% of people said they would trust that service and use it if it didn't get in the way of the user experience, which is always the tricky bit. So as Kanwar said, mobile phones are no longer phones. They are internet access devices. In 2010, the amount of data traffic grew by 2.6 times, and we're now reaching a point where in 2 years, 75% of mobile data will be video. It's already 50% of it. So people are downloading content. It's absolutely right. And apps are now, and Nokia is definitely paying the price for this, apps are now driving the user experience. So Android, Apple apps. Apple's got 10 billion downloads. And when we look at this, this is a reproduction of a slide from Distimo. We're looking at the percentage of paid versus free apps. Now I'm sure that graph is well out of date now. There's many more free apps being downloaded now. So this freemium business model has really exploded. And how does that work? How do you get services for free? Well, you get it for free because there's a huge internet advertising industry that's behind it. So data providers sell your data, the data they collect about you from your device, to data aggregators who work with yield optimizers to push campaigns to you to get the maximum relevancy and the maximum pertinency of that advert to your mobile device. It's a huge industry. It's now generating $50 billion a year. So when we look at the apps, we can see some of the things that they download. Now this is taken straight from Wall Street Journal. If anybody hasn't seen the Wall Street Journal What They Know series, and you're interested in privacy, it's a great place to see. And I've stolen this directly from them. So thank you, Wall Street Journal. Angry Birds takes your username, password, contacts, location, phone ID. What's it need those for? Certainly doesn't need it to execute the game. There's another one, Paper Toss, which is where you chuck a piece of paper into a bin. Gets your location. It's highly relevant for the app. All of these things are taking location because they're selling it on. They're selling on your location to make sure the ad is more relevant for you when you get it. How does that translate into numbers? Well, typical cost per meal, it's what the publishers will pay. It's cost per 1,000 clicks is about $3 across the industry. So including social network sites is about $2.56. Social network sites get a lot less. But Facebook in the US last year had 17% of all click-throughs. So Facebook is a huge power in the industry. And as you say, they're location specific. They're buying up companies with location algorithms and location analysis. The click-through rates, less than 0.1%. But a recent survey by a company called JY in the States in February 2011 showed a click-through rate of 34% if the advert was placed based on relevant location. And 17% of the people actually went to the store and bought at the store. So you can see there's a kind of a 300 times increase in productivity for your advert if you make it specific and location specific in particular. So at the moment, location-based adverts are commanding 6 to 10 times, sometimes much more than that, even 15 times premium on the cost per meal. This is what makes it attractive to the industry. This is what makes it less attractive to the users. Users are actually concerned. They're saying, actually, now that we know that, now that we understand that, we don't quite like that. And so there has to be some way of opting out of the process. In trying to actually sort of describe what it means, we clearly know that we get location-based services. And as Kamar says, lots of them are great. The question is, where is it going? And this is where the debate, I think, comes in more prominently. Song and Barabasi published a paper that used, I think it was Vodafone data, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. 50,000 people's anonymized mobile phone data, looking at their cell IDs, where they were, and they plotted out for all of those 50,000 people the entropy of their behavior. And from that entropy calculation, they were able to pinpoint which cell mask they would most likely be to a 93% probability. And they clearly state in the conclusions of the paper that they could predict where people would be based on their entropy. And that was across the entire 50,000 people. And what was amazing to them was the fact that even if people moved a lot or moved a little, they could still predict them with that sort of level of probability. Nathan Eagle and Tony Pentland have looked at lots and lots of associations of data, starting with his PhD work with 100 people and going up to 10 million people. He's looked at huge data sets. They were able to spot within the MIT who was a business student and who wasn't, just by their location and the people they mixed with. And then they've done all sorts of things. They've looked at bars in San Francisco, and they can tell you which bar is going to give you a 50% increased probability of ending up in hospital at the end of the evening. They've done work in Africa with prostitutes and shown that if more than 3 prostitutes get together, then there's a likelihood of a needle sharing occasion. So they're using that to push texts to the prostitutes to try and encourage them to go and seek a needle, a clean needle. They've been tracking disease spread across the world in nations. In the UK, somebody was tracking the spread, in Bristol University was tracking the spread of swine flu. And they got probably a better result than the NHS did, because the NHS said, stay at home, don't come in. They looked at Twitter. And as Kamar referred to earlier on, there was this fantastic website called Please Rob Me, which looked at Twitter and check-ins, and anybody who checked in was clearly not at home, and if they published that they were doing something on Twitter, then they were not at home and they were tweeting, so let's go and rob them. It was actually a privacy campaigner that was doing that. So the challenges are quite extreme. We've seen various different types of data being used in the cloud on large computing sets to infer behavioral analysis on 50,000 people. So there are very strange bits of contextual data, of which location is only one, that are being related by people today to try and infer behavioural patterns. And so the question is, how can we do something about that, and what are the ways we can try and minimise the impact when providing services? So I'm going to give three rather different examples. The first one is called privacy-triggered networking. This is about allowing people to communicate freely. So one of the things about freedom of speech is that you should be able to say anything at any time. Clearly you don't want to do that if you're at the wrong end of a football stadium. But maybe you do. Maybe you want to say something. Maybe I want to say something in this room about somebody in this room. If there are only two of us in the room, it'd be clear who is talking. If there's 100 people in the room, it's less clear. So one of the aspects of a peer-to-peer communication network can be that we can delay communications until there are enough people around me to make me anonymous. So we've designed a system that we will use for social networking, and we're testing at the moment in Lausanne. And here we can do it either by Bluetooth or by Wi-Fi. We can send messages, texts. And this goes out to every single phone in the district. But it will only go out when there's enough people. And I've got a sliding scale, so I can determine from that sliding scale at the top how many people I want around me before I'm prepared to send out this message. So I can control. If it's something fairly non-contentious, I don't care. If it's really contentious, I'll make sure there's at least 2,000 people around before I send it. So that's an example of how you can use privacy to control the way in which we communicate. Another more common approach is an approach called a privacy broker. Now, privacy broker is a trusted server. This is one we talked about in the beginning on the NSN survey, which acts as a proxy server. And what we do is we send information. So I'm Andy Matthews. I'm sending in information that I'm here in this building, and actually I'd like to buy a Jag this afternoon. So I send out the information, Andy Matthews, Jag, today, Cambridge. The server strips away as much information as I think is appropriate, and then says we have a consumer who has a validated account. He's an authentified purchaser, and he's looking for a Jaguar, and it's in the east of England. So the server now manages my privacy and sends out that request. The location-based service provider sends back lots of requests because it's now the whole of the east of England. And the trusted server, or the proxy server, now filters those to send it back to me. So I get the answer that I want with the correct user experience, and the trusted server does the work. But I have to trust that server. Lots of attempts have been made to do this by various companies. The bottom line is, unless you actually prevent the location-based application receiving the response, it is likely that some software in the application will send a response via the back door. So actually what you end up having to do if you really want to protect privacy is to interfere with the user experience. So proxy servers have not really been adopted as vehemently as one would imagine. Kamal also talked about traffic system. So this is a last example I'll give, because this is one which I think is where we'd like to be. It's this desired state that Nokia would like to end up with the provision of location-based services. It was a public-private academic partnership done in California. There's a researcher at Berkeley University who came up with the idea, and we implemented it. And what we're doing is providing an end-to-end real-time traffic update system using crowdsourced data from people's GPS-enabled phones. So you as a subscriber with your GPS-enabled phone, you subscribe to this system, and in return for that we will give you a free service that tells you what the traffic conditions are in any location where there are lots of people with GPS phones who are subscribers. So the more subscribers there are, the more efficient the system becomes. There's no fixed infrastructure required. And what we do in that process, in order to make it a win-win situation for both parties, is to guarantee the privacy of the people. So we have this kind of feedback process that combines data sources from existing road traffic networks, from other sources of traffic flow, government or traffic master kind of information, and we put all of that together and feed it back to the user. In order to preserve privacy, and this comes back to this idea of hiding in a crowd, what we use are virtual trip lines. So we've looked at where virtual trip lines could be placed. We've looked at where trip lines make sense in order to really understand the traffic flow. Putting them on this roundabout might not be a very good indicator, so we wouldn't put one here. But we would put one on Milton Road somewhere or other. So we analyse the traffic flow patterns in the first place, and then we create virtual trip lines. And what we do is, depending on the traffic flow, we actually spread those trip lines or merge them together so that there are always a minimum number of cars between trip lines. So you can hide in the crowd. So we vary those trip lines in real time. If there are no cars there, clearly traffic's flowing nicely and you don't need to know about it. So we can be very dynamic in those locations. And then we measure your speed as you cross the trip line. In order to preserve privacy, what we do is we then actually use sort of an error process. What we do is we add error to the data. So we spatially shift the data and we temporarily shift the data. So even if someone got access to the raw data from a couple of trip lines, they still wouldn't be able to figure out who it was because we've temporarily shifted the things, and you cannot track beyond 2 trip lines. So we anonymize the data in terms of spatiotemporal errors, and then we strip the IP address from it as it arrives at our location-based server. So we've done everything we can possibly do to remove any relevant information to make it impossible to track the people before it even gets into the system. Then we pump it through the system with a virtual database, virtual tripline databases, and we report back to the user. So the process gives you the real-time updates, and what we've done is we're trying to work towards these 7 principles, and Kanwar talked about industry principles. So Dr. Anne Kavukian, who's the Information Commissioner's Officer for Canada, is promoting these 7 principles. Proactive and preventative, so take the minimum amount of data that you need, which is what you discussed earlier on. Provide privacy by default, don't make it an opt-in. You should already be private and you have to opt out of privacy if you like. Privacy is embedded in the design. The system we saw there was designed around privacy. Trip lines were not real trip lines, they're virtual trip lines, so it's designed purely for the point of privacy. And a positive sum full functionality, it's a win-win. There's end-to-end lifecycle protection because actually we don't store any information. You know, the traffic information flow is real at that point in time and we have no IP on it. So we don't store any information. And it's all designed around the user to give them a good service. But clearly it's not an obvious thing. And so I'd like to give you, I've given you 3 examples of how it can be done, but it's hard work. Thank you.